Nicolas Maduro was one of Putin's friends outside Russia. Now that he's arrested, who the Kremlin still has to rely on? What heads of state openly support Moscow, and how far are they ready to go? Russia does not just lose an ally when a dictator falls. It loses a hiding place, a trade route, a money channel, a voting bloc, a stage prop that lets the Kremlin say, "See, we are not alone." I'm Elvira, a writer born in the Soviet Union, and today we are going to map Putin's remaining friends, what these relationships are really made of, what each side is buying, and the moment each one is likely to run. Here's our roadmap, and as we move through it, keep one phrase in your head. Who's next? The Loyal Vassal, Belarus, the closest ally and the most fragile. Arm dealers, North Korea and Iran. War supplies for cash, tag, and status. A friend too big, China. Help with the ceiling, where Russia is the junior partner. Pragmatic Middlemen, the states that keep trade flowing for a price. Transactional Partners, the ones who support Moscow only until the risk spikes. Who's left standing? Why more friends may walk away sooner than people expect? If independent analysis matters to you, subscribe, like, and share. It helps these videos reach people who want depth, not slogans. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join my think tank, use PayPal or SuperThanks, or hit the hype button. It's free and it helps a lot. Alright, let's start with the one ally Putin can actually use like a platform, Belarus. The Loyal Vassal. Belarus, led by the self-proclaimed President Alexander Lukashenko, is not just an ally. It's the closest thing Putin has to a controlled platform. This relationship began in the late 1990s. Belarus was looking to keep its Soviet-style government and economy largely intact. Russia needed a strategic buffer on NATO's border and a transit corridor for its energy exports. A partnership deal gave both sides what they needed. Belarus got money, preferential trade, and cheap energy. But this deal also cemented Lukashenko's authoritarian rule and made it near impossible for Belarus to become a democracy. More on this in my dedicated video. Fast forward to 2020. After Belarus's disputed election, huge crowds filled Minsk. Protests raged on week after week. Lukashenko didn't have a clean way out, so he went to the only person who could keep him standing. He flew to meet Putin in Sochi, and Putin helped. He threatened to use a reserve of security forces if the situation got out of control and announced a $1.5 billion loan package on the condition that Lukashenko stayed in power. That sent a clear message to Belarusian elites and security services. They sided with Lukashenko, and the protests were crushed. From that point, integration stopped being a theory. The push toward the Union state accelerated. In 2021, Moscow and Minsk agreed on a package of integration roadmaps covering areas like energy, taxes, and defense. The opposition in Belarus warned the price would be sovereignty. Then the full-scale invasion of Ukraine came, and Belarus became the launchpad. In February 2022, Belarus hosted large-scale joint drills with Russian troops that were deployed in tens of thousands. A few weeks later, part of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was staged from Belarusian soil. Despite that, Lukashenko refused to send his troops to fight in Ukraine. He said he'd only do it if Belarus is attacked. That was a wise move to keep his country safe, and Putin probably let it slide. The small and poorly trained Belarusian forces were unlikely to make much difference in the field anyway. And without the support of his military, Lukashenko, already unpopular in the country, could easily get overthrown. However, a different kind of escalation still happened. In June 2023, Belarus had started taking delivery of Russian tactical nuclear weapons. It was Moscow's first move of such warheads outside Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. Framed as protecting Belarus against the evil NATO, this move in fact exposed the country to higher risks. It made Belarus a possible counter-target. And the country has no control over the nukes that sit on its soil. The bottom is in Moscow. What it gets is more sanctions pressure, more military scrutiny, and possibly a lot of damage from accidents or sabotage. And the relationship in other fields keeps getting closer as well. In late 2024, Russia and Belarus were reported to be preparing a landmark security pact framed as a response to the changing global situation. This friendship is based on fear and need. Lukashenko fears a domestic revolt and relies on a powerful neighbor to keep him in power. Putin needs a loyal vassal to do his bidding. A military base right on NATO's doorstep, and proof that at least one neighbor is with us. This alliance may look unbreakable, but it's not built to last. Its strongest glue is personal loyalty. Once Lukashenko is gone, Belarus will enter a period of turbulence and likely drift away from Russia. But there's no reliable way to predict when this happens. Anything within the next 10 years is equally possible. Arms dealers. Now the two friends that do their best to keep Putin's war in Ukraine going, Iran and North Korea. These countries live under sanctions and pressure. They are strapped for cash but have a lot of weapons, which is why they are so eager to sell this surplus to Russia. In return, they can ask for money, technology, and status. Start with Iran, because Iran gave Russia a tool it could use every night: drones. Russian troops in Ukraine began using Iranian-designed Shahed drones widely after the autumn of 2022. The total number of these drones launched over 2 years is estimated at over 8,000. And Moscow didn't want to just buy drones. It also copied the recipe, setting up a new plant in Alabuga to mass-produce Iranian-designed attack drones, now rebranded as Giran. Next, North Korea. This is the bluntest relationship Putin has left, because it is a pure war pipeline. By February 2022, North Korea reportedly sent about 6,700 containers of munitions to Russia. Another widely cited figure is 4 million artillery shells. That is a supply contract that keeps Russian guns firing. Sanctioned Russian ships make repeated trips to North Korea's port of origin. They unload armor in Russian ports, then the cargo is moved across Russia by rail toward depots near the war. Because of the old ties that North Korea had with the Soviet Union, these North Korean shells perfectly fit the types of weapons used by the Russian military. And then the missiles showed up. In January 2024, Russia was first reported to use short-range ballistic missiles sourced from North Korea against Ukraine. Several months later, debris from a missile that struck Kharkov were found to come from a North Korean Hwasong-11 series missile. Kim Jong-un even did what Lukashenko wouldn't do: send his soldiers to fight in Putin's war. About 15,000 North Koreans are currently deployed in Ukraine and Russia's border regions. But Kim did not do this because he loves Putin. He did it for himself, to have a military force with actual combat experience. Russia's friendships with two pariah states are glued by mutual weakness. Russia needs war supplies on scale Iran and North Korea can provide it. Iran and North Korea need cash and access. Russia can pay and share. But there's a second layer. War suppliers don't just want money, they want upgrades. Every container of shells is also an invitation to ask for missile technology, satellite help, engines, air defense, or something else that changes their own balance at home. By helping Russia with its war, both rogue states are becoming stronger and likely to cause more trouble to their neighbors in the future. But there's still a bit of good news. As protests in Tehran are growing stronger, Ali Khamenei's plan to flee to Moscow has been leaked to media. There's a possibility that Iran's leader would follow in the steps of Bashar Assad, a fallen Putin's ally in Syria, who also escaped to Moscow. A friend too big. The history between Russia and China is long and troubled. It began in the mid-19th century with a dispute over large swaths of land in the Far East. Back in the day, Russia was stronger than China, so it took over those lands, forcing Beijing into a humiliating treaty. And China never forgot that. It remembers all the mistreatment that other nations gave it in those hard times known as a century of humiliation. If you want a glimpse of what it was like for China, its people, and foreigners who ended up there for various reasons, make sure to check out my historical novel, The White Ghost's Empire, set in Shanghai. I want to tell you a story about a city once called the Splendor of the East and the Whore of Asia. Shanghai, the 1920s, jazz drifting through open windows, opium smoke curling beneath chandeliers, white colonists in white suits, certain they were untouchable. Then the Russians arrived, not as conquerors, as refugees. Thousands fleeing the Bolsheviks, stepping onto the docks with nothing. To survive, they scrubbed floors, hauled crates, worked for a bowl of rice. And in doing so, they shattered the illusion of white supremacy, while the Chinese watched closely. And somewhere far away, Moscow was watching too, quietly dreaming of turning the ancient celestial empire into its greatest prize. The White Ghost's Empire, a historical novel about exile rising from the ashes and the clash of the mightiest powers on earth. Fast forward to the present day, and here we have Russian and Chinese officials talking about friendship. And this friendship is different from any other that Russia still has. With Belarus or North Korea, Russia is the stronger partner. But here, the stronger partner is China. China wants Russia to stay standing, but not to stand too tall. Beijing wants leverage, cheap resources, and a neighbor that won't collapse into chaos. But it also wants a clean exit if the costs spike. So China helps, and then it puts a ceiling on the help. The easiest proof is trade. In 2024, China and Russia hit a new record in bilateral trade, about 1.74 trillion yuan, or roughly $237 billion. The Kremlin loves that number because it sounds like we replaced Europe. We found a better market for our goods. But then something happened behind the scenes. Russian companies started complaining that payments with Chinese partners were getting stuck. Delays could stretch up to 6 months. Billions of yuan were held up as Chinese banks tightened compliance because of Western secondary sanctions pressure. And you can hear the frustration in the way Russian executives talk. One big metal exporter described how Chinese banks kept asking for more and more paperwork, freezing working capital and forcing the company to borrow more at higher interest rates. The executive's conclusion was basically stop being loud, get more secret. That's not the language of an alliance. That's the language of a smuggling economy trying to look respectable. Now, look at what China is willing to provide. European policy analysts and researchers have described China as the dominant source of Russia's dual-use imports, including many common high-priority items that matter for military production, like chips and navigation electronics. This support is real. It keeps Putin's war machine running. But there's still a line Beijing prefers not to cross in public, becoming the obvious arsenal. China's direct arms exports to Russia remain marginal compared to the scale of Russia's needs. Beijing wants the profit without the label of co-belligerent. At the same time, China buys Russian energy and raw materials with huge discounts. It sells cars and machinery into a market that Western brands abandoned. Overall, China is too big and too strong to be Russia's real friend. Instead, it became Russia's biggest customer and supplier, but also its strictest manager. Pragmatic Middlemen. Turkey and the UAE are two states that keep Moscow's international trade flowing, but they are not doing it out of kindness or some ideological reasons. For their help, they take a huge cut and back off when the risk is too high. For Putin, these countries matter because they connect him to the outside world after the West closed the official doors on him. Banking, shipping, spare parts, consumer goods, even basic industrial components. That's an alliance built on logistics. Turkey is the clearest example of how this works. After 2022, Turkish trade with Russia surged. Then Washington started pushing harder with sanctions threats, and the numbers reacted fast. Turkish exports to Russia fell sharply. There's a small detail that says a lot. In March 2024, a Turkish oil terminal in Hatay, which had handled record volumes of Russian products in the year before, stopped accepting Russian oil cargoes. The company said it was a voluntary decision to align with global sanctions pressure even when shipments were technically allowed. The UAE plays a different role. It's less about border and more about finance, re-export, and corporate paperwork. The US, Britain, and the EU are pressing the UAE to crack down on firms helping Russia evade sanctions. Officials are especially concerned about flows of chips, electronics, and machinery. The UAE benefits from its trade with Russia, but it also has to keep access to the dollar system and Western banks, so it performs a balancing act. Trade continues, but the rules tighten and the gray zone gets pricier. Then you have Central Asia, where the middleman role is even more naked. After the full-scale invasion, Russian companies flooded Kazakh partners with requests to help circumvent sanctions and import needed goods. The language is almost comical in its honesty. It's basically, please buy it for us, ship it to you, then ship it to us. This is what Putin's friendship often looks like now. Not a political alliance, but sheer profit-making. These friends will have no trouble abandoning him once the risk overweights gains. Transactional partners. Most of Putin's friends don't send things. They send something cheaper, such as UN votes. The scoreboard shows a thick belt of countries voted no or abstain on resolutions supporting Ukraine. Not because they love Moscow, but because they don't want to pay for taking sides. Putin knows this. So he sells them away to stay neutral without looking weak at home. Sometimes the currency is food. After Russia pulled out of the Black Sea grain deal, Putin promised free grain to a short list of African states. Later, Russia said it had shipped 200,000 tons of free grain to 6 African countries. It's not enough to feed a continent, but the point was a show. Russia delivers, the West lectures. Sometimes the currency is security, the kind that keeps a ruling group alive. In Mali, Wagner, the Russian private military group closely tied with Kremlin, became a symbol of that deal after the junta kicked out French and UN forces. In June 2025, Wagner left Mali, but the Kremlin-controlled Africa Corp would stay. And sometimes the currency is access. In the Central African Republic, Russia is providing protection to the ruler in exchange for access to resources. A president doesn't have to love Russia to accept that trade. He just has to want to wake up tomorrow still president. This is why Putin keeps talking about a multipolar world. It flatters leaders who don't want to be judged. It tells them, you don't have to choose values. You can choose transactions. But this relationship is fragile because it doesn't go beyond a market stall. And markets change quickly. Grain can be delayed, security can disappoint, and Russia's own war has made it harder for Moscow to offer the one thing that used to impress people: competence. So, yes, Putin still collects votes and a semblance of political support. He still finds leaders willing to take a meeting and sign a partnership deal. But look closely at what's being traded. Just short-term cover paid for in wheat, weapons, or men with guns. Who's left standing? When people ask who's still with Putin, they usually imagine a neat circle of loyal states. The reality is messier. It's more like layers of ice on a river. Some parts are thick, some parts are thin, and everything shifts with the weather. The thick ice is small, Belarus and North Korea. A few others who are already sanctioned, already isolated, already in too deep to pretend they have options. Their motive is survival that makes their bond with Moscow real but also desperate. Then you get the thin ice. The countries that trade with Russia but don't want to be seen as Russia's allies. They don't pledge loyalty. They hedge and keep their flags clean. And you can measure that hedging in how often neutral becomes the safe word at international forums. Over time, the UN votes on Ukraine have shown two tracks at once. Russia does not win the room, but it can still prevent a clean global consensus. In February 2025, the UN General Assembly adopted another Ukraine-related resolution, but with a big block of abstentions. That's the shape of Putin's remaining reach. Not leadership, just friction. Now, look at the cracks inside Russia's old neighborhood. Armenia was once treated as a predictable Russian ally. Then the war in the region exposed the limits of Moscow's protection. In February 2024, Armenia's prime minister said his country had effectively frozen participation in the Russian-led CSTO. Days later, Armenia boycotted CSTO's meetings and had no permanent representative there. Even Serbia, the poster child for traditional friendship, shows how conditional these ties are. Serbian leaders keep refusing sanctions, but they also keep trying to stay on an EU track. In mid-2025, President Vučić visited Ukraine for a summit, but refused to sign a declaration because it was anti-Russian. That is a balancing act in practice. Putin's problem is not that he has zero partners. His problem is that the terms are getting worse. Every year, the discount grows. Every year, the routes get riskier. Every year, more friends want payment upfront, and fewer are willing to be seen with the product. So what's left for Putin is a coalition that can keep him afloat, but can't make him strong. It can supply shells, move some trade, and give him talking points, but it can't restore the old model where Russia was a respected regional power. That changes how far he can push. It changes how long he can sustain a war of attrition. And it changes the internal psychology of his own elite, because elites don't care about slogans. They care about whether the system still delivers. So that's Putin's shrinking circle. A vassal, two arms dealers, one friend who's really a manager, and a long line of middlemen who will vanish the moment the risk outweighs the profit. Strange, isn't it, how dictators choose their friends? If you were a dictator, who would you rely on? Of course, we are not here to give advice to bad guys, but bad guys don't watch us anyway. They're far too busy admiring themselves. If you want more big picture maps like this, subscribe, because 2026 is going to be full of friends turning into liabilities overnight. And if you'd like to support my work, Think Tank, PayPal, Super Things, and the Hype button are right below.